It has been the most powerful tool to stop voter discrimination for the past half century in America. But today, the U.S. Supreme Court all but threw out the Voting Rights Act. And Andrew, this is an all but inconceivable kind of idea. Not many years ago, this is bipartisan support, but all of a sudden now, this throws everything a kilter.
And the impacts are already beginning to be felt, Rich. Since 1965, the Voting Rights Act has worked to ensure access to the ballot in states and communities with long histories of voting discrimination. In its 5-4 ruling along ideological lines today, the court kept the law on the books, but threw out the map that it's based on, focusing primarily on southern states, saying the map is based on data from 40 years ago. The upshot that any voting-related laws passed in those states that have been covered by the law, like voter ID, can now go into effect, and that's already happening in Texas. That pending a change in the law. And if the law is to be salvaged, Congress will have to update the map using current figures, but that is highly unlikely given the partisan split in Washington, and that limiting minority access to the ballot box is seen to help Republican candidates. So additional voting restrictions, if approved, could and will impact the 2014 midterm elections. While the Voting Rights Act primarily focuses on minority representation in Congress and where district lines are drawn, there's recently been a lot of movement on voting rights as a whole, including voter ID laws, limiting early voting days, and more. According to the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU, 42 states, the ones colored in, have moved or passed voter restrictions in 2013 alone, many aided by the legislative group ALEC, which drafts conservative-leaning legislative language that is frequently copied and submitted by state lawmakers. Rich.
All right. So, Andrew, there were two parts, but from a practical level, what the court today said was, yeah, where Alabama and some of these southern states were back in the 60s, it's a different world right now. Look, we got a black president, reelected, for the last 2 times. So we don't really need it anymore. Reaction's been swift to this. I've seen some say, including Congressman Lewis, a huge figure in the civil rights thing, that he couldn't even put into words how devastating it was. Why are so many people so petrified? I know you articulated some of the concerns here, but why are they so worried? Because the Justice Department, you can't disenfranchise someone to vote here, but is it the practical? They don't have the resources to go police this all, or is it because you can kind of do this on the sly legally?
Well, how many times have we reported on movements around the country to try to restrict access to the polls, whether it's voter ID or whether it's, changing the voter, the district lines to provide for representation in Congress of minority groups of particularly blacks and Hispanic citizens? That now doesn't have to have a check on it in those states where there's been a check on it for the last 50 years, the one that comes through
Because just,
through this
I think
law.
you explained this, but before today, if those designated states wanted to change their voter registration or voting laws, they first had to go to the Justice Department to get the okay. Now today, they do whatever they want, and it's up to the Justice Department to catch me if you can.
And not only that, but they've already begun the process of doing it. A lot of these states that had laws on the books that hadn't been able to take effect are now being pushed into effect. I mentioned Texas. That's already happening in Texas with their voter ID law. They're implementing it today. And so there's one fewer check. And again, these are areas where historically there have been efforts to block minority representation both in Congress and at the ballot box.
Dominic, what would you say to, because this is basically what Scalia and the majority opinion said was, that was then and this is now. Look at turnout numbers. Look at the last 2 presidential elections. We needed it then, and while we have racism today, we just don't need this now. Every state should be able to come up with their own laws. This isn't the Jim Crow South anymore. What's your reaction?
Well, I spend quite a bit of time in the South, and it doesn't appear to be Jim Crow anymore. And as Chief Judge Roberts wrote in his opinion, our country has changed. Granted, everyone can see that things have changed for the better in the country. Yet, there are many that would argue these federal monitors, if you will, are still necessary. This could greatly impact Congress, as Andrew mentioned, in the midterm elections, because it could greatly, if you don't have that federal monitor, almost like the NYPD, stop and frisk, who's going to watch what's going on? It could greatly change things, greatly.
It's hard, isn't it, to try and put some calculation to where we are and where we're not. And somebody used Alabama as an example. Yes, 40% of white males voted for Obama. Only 15% in the state of Alabama did. What that means, I'm not sure, except it's harder now to stop something that shouldn't happen if you have to do it after the fact, right?
Absolutely, and it's even more so than when we're talking about in terms of having a federal monitor for stop and frisk, because that can be adjusted reasonably quickly. Once you have an election, you have 4 years to try and get it right again. You may have someone in who shouldn't have been in, and all we have to do is go back to the voting history in the country. Initially, the only people who could vote in the United States were white male landowners. And those weren't people who owned a quarter-acre lot someplace or a condo. You owned a lot of land. I mean, you were like Bill Gates in order to vote. And that meant that reasonably well-to-do, even white men couldn't vote. Women certainly couldn't vote. African Americans were treated as 3/5 of one human being, not even a whole person, and they couldn't vote. So looking at where we are today, if you simply go back to recent elections, looking at what happened in Cleveland, which is roughly 53% African American, and looking at what happened in Florida, in Dade and Miami, in Dade and Broward counties, which are predominantly African American and Latino. And Dade in particular, I believe it was roughly 65% Latino. For the census purposes, they're counted as white. But nonetheless, it took people hours and hours to stand online just to vote. Now, how long are you going to stand online before you leave? Suppose you have a medical condition, you can't. And it happens to be only in these communities that are communities of color, with respect to the recent elections.
But if I could, there was a perversity to that, Andrew, wasn't there? Which was, in some of the states that put up the most amount of roadblocks to let minority populations vote here, that actually caused a bizarre 180 where more people turned out and waited 8, 9, 10 hours online to vote.
You did see that, but you wonder, A, would that happen in a midterm election as opposed to a presidential election with the minority at the top of the ticket for the Democrats? B, would the restrictions that are inevitably going to come into place now prohibit them from voting this time around, even after 8 or 10 hours? But there's one other backlash issue I want to bring your attention to. We're in the middle of the immigration debate right now, where the Republican Party is saying if we don't reach out to the Latino community, we're going to lose them forever. There will be pushes to try to have this updated in Congress, to make Republicans in Congress vote against the Voting Rights Act or vote against minority representation. If it can be framed the same way as pitting the Republican Party against black and Latino voters, it could actually be a bit of a cudgel for Democrats and may force Republicans' hands.
It's going to be interesting.
They'll probably not.
Yeah, but you tried.
I would just like to look at Florida very briefly, because when you look at Dade and Broward, they weren't certified until after the election had already been called. So again, it tells you that there still are some issues here. If the rest of Florida can be called, how is it that these two counties in this pivotal election couldn't be?
It's going to be at the Congress. I think Andrew said it right here. I wouldn't hold your breath. No. They're going to do anything soon here. But in the political dynamic, it's interesting. I'll just leave one point. It wasn't that many years ago where Democrats and Republicans stood shoulder to shoulder, renewed this every year with a unanimous vote that the Voting Rights Act was a good thing. Now, here we are, it's supposed to have progress in 2013, and I could argue take a step backwards.
2006, it was reapproved by Congress with more than 300 votes in the House.
Yeah, good luck with that right now. All right, coming up next, everyone. An interesting poll came out just since we've been on the air, and it shows a major shift in the mayoral race, and you will not believe who is in first place here as we're nearing July. We're going to have more on that after this break, so stay with us.